Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming relating to ethics, and our speaker is Katie Watson, who is an associate professor of medical social sciences, medical education, and obstetrics and gynecology, who has taught bioethics, medical humanities, and constitutional law for over 15 years at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. She's also a lawyer who began her career clerking in the federal judiciary and practicing in public interest law. And in 2017 to 2018, she worked part-time as senior counsel to the Women's and Reproductive Rights Project of the ACLU of Illinois. Professor Watson is currently on the board of the National Abortion Federation, a member of and bioethics advisor to the Planned Parenthood Federation of America's National Medical Council, and on the editorial board of the AMA Journal of Ethics. Her new book, which she's here to speak to us about, Scarlet A, The Ethics, Law, and Politics of Ordinary Abortion, was published in 2018 by Oxford University Press, and it is the winner of the George Orwell Award for Distinguished Contribution to Honesty and Clarity in Public Language. So, welcome.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here. The first time I taught a medical school class on reproductive ethics was the first time that I looked up the prevalence of abortion in the United States. And I began by sharing those facts with my class. At the time, this was the fact. 30% of all American women were expected to have one or more abortions before menopause. And I told them that the frequency with which their future patients, not to mention their colleagues, friends, families, and themselves would engage with this procedure was one reason that the topic deserved their attention, regardless of what medical specialty they planned to go into. And then I moved on to my next point. It was like I had popped a cork on champagne. The class did not move with me. Instead, it just bubbled with whispers. 1 in 3, 1 in 3. Did she say 1 in 3? That can't be right, right? And it's a moment as a lecturer where you're about to move on to your PowerPoint, and the class is just on a different ship, sailing elsewhere. And here's what I want to confess to you and why that was a turning point in my thinking, because I was shocked too. I was a lawyer who had a fellowship in reproductive freedom and civil liberties when I was in law school, and I was intimately familiar with the constitutional law of abortion. And they were medical students who were about to learn the medicine of abortion. But none of us understood what technically is called the epidemiology of abortion. Why was that? Why is the fact that abortion is common procedure not common knowledge? That epiphany of what we were all in that room lacking is part of what propelled me on the journey that I won't say ended with the book, but one culminating piece is this book, setting out to learn more. One of the things I learned is that scholars have a term for this, and it's called the prevalence paradox. That's the term they use to describe the fact that many women have abortions, many keep quiet about it. So it's common, and they do it like a circle. It's common for people associated with abortion, and I say associated with to say family, friends, partners, providers, people associated with abortion to be stigmatized as deviant and to face discrimination. To avoid that stigma, everyone in these groups, many people in these groups, keep quiet about their association with abortion, and common behavior continues to be misperceived as deviant. All right, that's the prevalence paradox. How could something so common be perceived as so unusual or deviant behavior? Now, today, the correct statistic is 1 in 4. The updated numbers in 2014 are that if 2014 rates held, 24% of all women in the U.S. who are of reproductive age now will have one or more abortions by menopause, 1 in 4. That's the lowest number since 1973. And to me, 1 in 4 is still incredibly high. Now, everyone's doing it is not a winning ethical argument. You didn't need a bioethicist to tell you this. Your mom told you that. But it is a piece of evidence that I think deserves serious consideration. As a bioethicist, I'm trained to see all patients as moral agents. And I see no reason to grant any lesser status to the women and couples who decide abortion is right for them than to the women and couples who decide that it is not. And I want to give you a different statistic. If you just look at unintended pregnancies, right? If you look at all pregnancies in America, 19% end in abortion. All pregnancies, 19% a year, end in abortion. If you just look at unintended pregnancies, 42% of those end in abortion. Right? If we narrow down to the people who didn't, and many of us are that third whoops baby who was unintended but not unwanted, right? So unintended doesn't even mean unwanted pregnancies. There's no data to define what's unwanted. But this is very common. Yet, as a result of this stigma-inspired silence, we hear more about the idea of abortion than the experience of abortion. And it was shocking for me to realize, even as a medical school professor and a lawyer, there was so much that I didn't know about abortion care. So I want to share part of this journey with you of what I've learned that I know now that I didn't know then that might be useful to you, and I hope your everyday life. One of the first things I realized when I delved deeper was the missing topic of conversation is what I've come to call ordinary abortion. The advocates who drive the public abortion discussion often highlight what I think of as extraordinary abortion, extreme cases of abortion need on the pro-choice side, or extreme cases of what they would call abortion abuse on the side of those who oppose the legal right to abortion. So those supporting legality will tell you about pregnant 12-year-olds, women who have been gang raped, women carrying babies with terrible fetal anomalies that want to terminate so they can have another pregnancy. Those opposing its legality will focus on the few procedures that happen much later in pregnancy, or focus on a procedure they feel is gruesome, they dubbed partial birth abortion, that sort of thing. And it makes rhetorical sense on either side to focus on extreme cases that evoke strong emotions. That's how newspapers are written. That's how lawsuits are won. I get it, and it's not a criticism. But the result is, in public, the cases we discuss most are the ones that happen least. These cases occur on both sides account for maybe 5% of all abortion cases. And in bioethics, we do that too. We're attracted to the neon light case, right? Like, lots of people can't get diabetes care. That's sad. You're going to clone a 9-headed baby? I'm on it, right? Like, we're excited about what's the new ethics issue. And that's a mistake in my field. So this is a funny plug of like, let me tell you the boring stories. But I wanted to write about the 95% in the middle. And I wanted to write about that because I think when public discourse doesn't reflect the majority of experience in any area, we've lowered our chances of getting smart policy. Right? Start with the facts. And the second is that the drama-trauma cases are grounded in the politics of sympathy. But when it comes to women's rights, I'm more interested in the politics of respect, giving credence to the moral reasoning of ordinary women and couples, and taking their experience in moving forward into policy instead of taking philosophical abstractions and imposing them on families. So, while advocates have been arguing about rights over the last 46 years, politicians have been cozying up to interest groups, and scholars have been analyzing abstractions about fetuses and embryos, American behavior has quietly established abortion as routine medical care. So what did I learn when I started digging into statistics? And I am not a numbers person. I thought this was going to be boring, and it was exactly the opposite. Well, who gets abortions in the United States? I'll confess I didn't know I had stereotypes until they were disrupted while I was reading these studies. Mothers aren't who I pictured in abortion clinics, so it struck me in my research that 59% of abortion patients in the U.S. already have one or more children, which means the majority of abortion patients have intimate knowledge of how embryos grow and what happens on the other end of that pregnancy because they've experienced it personally and don't need to hear a speech from the state or be shown pictures. They know what happens. His name is Bobby. I pictured women sitting alone, but 88% of abortion patients are dating or married to the man they got pregnant with. That challenged a different stereotype I didn't know that I had, and I share that not to stigmatize or disparage the other 12% who are pregnant outside of established romantic relationships, but just to say I was so used to all my life talking about this as a women's issue when unintended pregnancy could be considered in our politics and our social conversation as a couples issue and a family issue, but it's always a women's issue. Legally, that's correct, and it must remain that way. Socially and politically, we've let that legal discourse infect our dinner table conversation in a way that's not productive. And lastly, 60% of these women are in their 20s. And I think of this I did have a sense of, that a huge number of these patients were at crucial turning points in their lives where carrying a pregnancy to term or ending a pregnancy could mean the difference between finishing an education, partnering or co-parenting with someone who really wasn't right for them, or they weren't done getting to a point where they were ready to either become a mother at all or become a mother again. And that resonated with me, the youth. And so it's made me think, how much of this is an issue of age discrimination? Of older pundits and politicians saying, you know what I would do if I were 20 again. I guess I've just forgotten the terror of that, the practical, but you know what we ought to do when we're in that situation versus people who are in that situation. So again, as I said earlier, just because something's common doesn't mean it's ethical. So let's transition from abortion behavior to abortion opinion. And the opinion I'm interested in is yours. And if you just felt a shudder of like, oh God, I don't want to talk about this, that's okay, I'm not going to ask you to speak. I want to say that I assume everyone in this room, there's just a wide range of opinions. And I want to say in the nicest possible way, I don't care what you think about abortion. I care that you think about abortion, okay? And I'm not going to promise you a safe space in this room because there's no such thing. We get bruised in the world. I want to invite you to create momentarily together a brave space where we express something we think and we respect our differences and we feel entitled to be respected ourselves, right? But what's more important is being present and counted than being safe. Cool? So I'm going to ask you to do a short and painless exercise, but that does require everyone to stand. Thank you. Thank you so much. You guys are in your game. Thank you. I love it. Medical students aren't always. Okay. I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and what they require is for you to move to indicate your response to the question, okay? So this is going to be our strongly agree side. This is our 5. This is our strongly disagree side. And then you could be anywhere in the middle you want based on your feelings in response to my question. Does this make sense? So I'm going to say a couple statements. If you strongly agree, you just move towards this side of the room. If you all agree, we'd all just kind of be clustered by the windows. Or we'll be spread out. If you all disagree with what I say, we'll be clustered over here or we'll be spread out however people feel. Does that make sense? Okay, we're just going to do a couple of these. We're going to start with your opinion on the law. Okay? First question. I think abortion should be legal in an otherwise healthy pregnancy 2 weeks after conception. Strongly agree that should be legal for a person to decide whether to end or continue that pregnancy. Strongly disagree, think that should be illegal. I'm starting easy. 2 weeks after conception. All right, I get some of you in the middle are like, there's just not room. I have a feeling here. Okay, but that's fair. There's a spectrum. You're not all going to be on the wall, even if you could be, and I get that. Okay, now I'm going to flip it. Abortion should be legal in an otherwise healthy pregnancy 2 weeks before delivery. Changed my mind. It's 38 weeks. I'm going to deliver in 2 weeks. Strongly disagree or strongly agree. Otherwise healthy pregnancy, no medical issue. I changed my mind. It's 38 weeks. There's no such woman. Let me just be really clear, but we're just doing an exercise on the law. 2 weeks before delivery, changed my mind. Totally healthy pregnancy. More of a spread. Less of a spread than some audiences, let me tell you. You guys are awesome. Okay, this is fascinating. Okay, so you're sprinkled, and some of you are probably like, I don't like it, but I don't like the law getting in there. And some of you are like, that's insane. Why are we even talking about this? Like, right, there's a big range here. So here's the point I want to make to you about how thin the words we have in this conversation are. If you were on this side of the wall for question 1 and you're on this side of the wall for question 2, You are pro-choice at certain stages of pregnancy and pro-fetal rights in other stages of pregnancy, right? There's no one word that describes your position throughout pregnancy. And I say pro-fetal rights rather than pro-life because I work with physicians in this area who will all be very quick to tell you I save lives. I am pro-life. I don't think embryonic or sometimes fetal life is a life that has the same moral status as a woman, and I think it's morally acceptable for me to destroy this. People in my community have been murdered, right? I don't use the term pro-life, but I don't use the term anti-choice because everyone's for something, right? And I'm not trying to exclude anyone from the conversation. It's pro-fetal rights. You think fetuses should have legal rights above and beyond or equal to women's, right? And some of you have a spread in that position, which is fascinating. Okay, now I'm going to shift that to explain that pro-choice is a legal position, right? That says you don't think the government should have policies of forced childbearing. It should be a private decision. But it doesn't say anything about what you think the ethics of that private decision-making are. There's another conversation to be had, which we rarely have in the United States. So let's have a little bit of it today. So again, this is our strongly agree side. This is our strongly disagree side. If a woman I've never met is 8 weeks pregnant and she doesn't want to have a baby, I think it's morally acceptable for her to have an abortion if she wants. I think it's ethically acceptable, 8 weeks. Doesn't want to have a baby. This is strongly agree, this is strongly disagree. Doesn't mean you want it to be illegal, you just think, I don't think that's ethically right. Interesting, okay. Now we're going to make it a little more personal, and I don't care about gender or age in this question. I'm just going to ask you to imagine outside your experience, if that's necessary, if I or my partner was 8 weeks pregnant and I/we didn't want to have a baby, I think it's morally acceptable for me/us to have an abortion if we want to. Does that change anything for you when you're talking about yourself versus someone else? No. A little bit? Sure. Okay, I see a little movement here. Cool. There's a little movement. Some of you are saying, I'm not sure that's right for me, right? But I think it's ethically right for someone else. And that's another point. Like when people share their ethics opinions, clarification of like, are you talking about your own personal frameworks for decision making? Or are you talking about the frameworks you think other people ought to use, right? And again, I don't care what the answer is, but I need to understand what it is that we're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to go back to your stranger frameworks, and it's just a couple moves for some of you about our person we've never met who's 8 weeks pregnant. I'm going to move the gestational age. I'm going to say, if a woman I've never met who is 23 weeks pregnant doesn't want to have a baby, I think it's morally acceptable for her to have an abortion if she wants. I'll let you know that's legal. It's protected under versus Roe v. Wade. And viability, the point at which states are allowed under Roe to ban abortions except for life and health, happens around 24 weeks. So she's getting close, but she's in that legal range. We're talking about ethics now. Okay? If a woman who's 23 weeks pregnant doesn't want to have a baby, I think it's ethical for her to have an abortion. Strongly agree, strongly disagree, spread yourselves as you see fit. She's a week away from that viability line, as it's been put in law and medicine at this point. Okay, there's a little movement over here. Some. Okay. Now, I told you she didn't want to have a baby. And I really work hard to never say just, because when people are like, because she just didn't want to have a baby, like just? Like, that's a thing, like to have a baby, to be a parent, bring a person over. She just didn't want to do that. Oh, she just didn't want to meet us for lunch. Like, okay. She didn't want to have a baby. That's a thing. Okay. But so I think that's a reason. But let me change the reason. Same person you've never met, 23 weeks pregnant. She doesn't want to have a baby because the man she got pregnant with abused her and kicked her out of his house. And she got laid off from her part-time job. And the combination of those two changes means she suddenly has no idea how she's going to keep the 3 kids she already has fed, clothed, and sheltered. I think it's morally acceptable for this woman to have an abortion at 23 weeks if she wants. This is strongly agree, strongly disagree. Do the reasons cause any movement? For some people they do, for some they don't. Okay, great. So this is interesting, too, because this goes to the politics of sympathy, right? Reasons are inextricably bound with your assessment of the moral status of embryos and fetuses. If you rank that status highly, only the most compelling reasons, right, in general or at certain gestational ages, are going to adjust that at all. If you think the moral status of embryos or fetuses is lower, there are less compelling reasons that you will find completely acceptable, right? And this is my problem with conversation about good and bad reasons for abortion. We're still always talking about the moral status of embryos and fetuses, but we don't name it. We get into just behavior judgment and shaming without talking about, actually, we have fundamental ethical disagreements about the origin of human life and its significance and potential, and we're not having that conversation. So thank you for engaging in this experiment. Let's sit down and kind of draw some other lessons out of it. I've done this only a couple times, and the range in the groups is amazing of the different groups I've been with. Thank you for sharing your opinions with each other and with me. Terrific. So this exercise, for me, helps me remember and illustrates for me a couple of things I've learned. I don't have the luxury of the option of not talking about abortion because I have to in my teaching, and I don't have the luxury of only talking to people I agree with because I teach a huge range of students that come from all over and have all different perspectives. And that's been a challenge, but it's been a gift and a privilege over the years, and it has led me to now work with professional groups of physicians who provide abortions and learn more about their clinical ethics issues and their practice and work. So for me, that's been challenging but so rich. And here are a couple things I've learned. One is it's very helpful for me in class to draw a grid about the law of abortion and the ethics of abortion, right? Is abortion a constitutional right? Yes, no. We can have that conversation. For me, it's a short one. Yes. But we can talk about the law, and I will in a moment. Is abortion an ethical act? Yes, no. Okay, we can have a much longer conversation about that, but in our country, we've conflated the legal conversation with the ethical conversation, right? Very rarely, if we have a dispute about something you say, and I say, Sherry, if you keep saying that, I wish you would stop saying that. And if you don't keep saying it, I don't think we're going to be able to be friends. No one hears me as saying, Sherry, I think the government should take away your First Amendment right to say that, right? Then we don't immediately go there. But somehow in abortion, we immediately go there where if you disapprove or think Act X is unethical, the government ought to ban it for somebody else. And that's part of our issue. So breaking out into law and ethics, as I just did. And in other groups, you'll see lots of support for legality and then a big spread on ethics, which is fascinating. It's also, as I said, are you speaking about your own ethics or ethics of general applicability? This term, the moral status of the embryo or the moral status of the fetus, pro-choice people, are uncomfortable talking about that, and I think we need to get a little more comfortable. We also need to remember to talk about the moral status of women, which I will get to. And lastly is this idea of gradualism. That is the philosophical idea that there isn't any one turning point in which an embryo or fetus becomes a person. And a philosopher named Maggie Little uses this example of it's like having the materials for a house all lying around. The bricks were there, the boards were there, but we all get it's a house in progress. And at some point it really looks like a house, but there's no heating inside. There's no, and at what point is it a house? Well, gradualism just says the moral status increases over time, week by week. And for different people, a tipping point, there's a so what in a happy, healthy, wanted pregnancy of what's that tipping point. But when you're talking about termination, tipping points vary for different people and having to think that through. So pro-choice is a legal position, and I want to spend a few minutes, and only a few minutes, on the law in this area. Because we talk about law a lot and we talk about ethics less. So I understand we have a robust Q&A time and we could talk about law and politics more there. But I'm going to spend the majority of my time now on ethics, law, and then ethics. So in Roe versus Wade in 1973, this ruling that women have a constitutional right to abortion was not a ruling on the moral status of embryos and fetuses. Instead, the Roe court said, We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins. When those trained in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology, which today we might call bioethicists, are unable to arrive at any consensus, the judiciary, at this point in the development of man's knowledge, is not in a position to speculate as to the answer. So Roe versus Wade didn't say embryos or fetuses have no moral status. It said they are not persons under the Constitution, right? There's no evidence in the text of the Constitution that would suggest the framers intended to include them. You would have to have a constitutional amendment, right? It didn't say they don't have any moral status. It really made abortion an issue of conscience. It's also true we have an absence of embryos and fetuses in the Constitution, or any way the word person could be logically applied to them, that is in the way it's used in the Constitution. Women are encompassed in the word person, right? So taking sort of your equal protection theory with this absence combines to say this decision has to be left to individual women, couples, and families, right? That's what Roe established. And Americans have disagreed about abortion since Roe was decided. I don't actually see that as a problem. I think Roe acknowledged that disagreement, said, okay, work it out yourselves in your homes. As the Supreme Court put it in the 1992 case that affirmed Roe, Casey versus Pennsylvania, men and women of good conscience can disagree, and we suppose some shall disagree about the profound moral and spiritual implications of terminating a pregnancy, even in its earliest stage. Some of us as individuals find abortion offensive to our most basic principles of morality, but that cannot control our decision. Our obligation is to define the liberty of all, not to mandate our own moral code. So the idea that if the Supreme Court allows abortion to be a constitutional right, somehow it's saying that abortion is just a fine, awesome thing that everyone should do every weekend when they can, is not the correct interpretation of this law. However, Americans often equate the concept of morality with religion, right? And I want to talk about what I see as a problem with the current abortion debate. After abortion became legal through a constitutional right, legal nationally, it was legal in some states before, the pro-choice arguments began focusing exclusively on the law, and the moral ground in the debate became occupied by abortion's opponents, right? That the moral argument is against abortion, and the pro-choice argument is one of law and policy and freedom and privacy. Leave me alone, right? And those are hard, because when juxtaposed with the murder of a vulnerable human being, arguments in law and policy just seem cold. They seem like they're missing the point. And without that moral piece, they don't make any sense. When abortion was a crime, the dominant argument was public health. Women die or are physically harmed when abortion is illegal. But if killing an embryo is tantamount to killing an adult, it's nonsensical to argue that lives are saved by legalizing a procedure that kills almost 1 million embryos a year, right? You still have to make that argument. And that's true of the privacy and women's autonomy arguments, too. If you learned that your neighbor was murdering men, women, and children in their basement, no one in this room would say, well, that wouldn't be my choice. And I don't think they should do it, and I'll tell them so. But it's a free country. And I value their privacy and their need to murder people for personal fulfillment and economic advancement. Yeah, you would try to stop them by any means possible. So any of us in this room who are not having the same reaction to walking past an abortion clinic need to be able to explain why. And I think that the pro-choice movement has not done a good job of this. We have not done a good job of articulating the moral case for why abortion is either morally acceptable or for others, a moral good in the world. So in my last section, I want to share with you some of that thinking and some of that language, because I don't think it's out there in a way that it could or should be, and it's not appropriate for every conversation, but we all should, anyone who is on this side of the room, which is all of you, should be able to say these sentences in a peaceful, civil way with people you like and respect who might see it otherwise. So, first, you have to articulate the premise. Embryos are not equivalent to people. And I'm using the term embryos repeatedly because it's not just that, well, let me just give you the straight number. The medical shift from embryo to fetus happens right at the beginning of week 11. And the reason medically those are different terms, or it's a shifting point, is a fetus is when all the anatomical structures are in place. There's still lots of development to do, but that's when you see under, this teensy thing, but it has all the parts, to put it simply, right? The vestigial tail is gone. We have recognizable face. We've got 10 fingers, 10 toes. We've all seen the pictures. So 80% of all abortions happen with embryos, timing-wise. Now, but abortion is always referred to the right or the status of the fetus, as if the morning you wake up pregnant, you have a fetus inside of you. Is that a distinction with a difference? I don't know. That's up to you. Right? But I just want to use the accurate language. So I often refer to the debate over the moral status of embryos and fetuses. Okay? So the secular argument, we're going to stick with secular arguments, not religious, because I read your materials. The secular argument against abortion is biological. When an egg is fertilized by a sperm, it becomes a one-celled zygote, and that single cell contains the genetic blueprint for a human being. No one disputes that science. One version of the philosophical next step is calls this substantial identity. People are intrinsically valuable because of what we are, and what we are is a physical organism which comes to be at conception. After conception, we get bigger, and they call this quantitative change, but we don't undergo substantial qualitative change through development from a human blastocyst to an adult human being. Right? That's the argument, the substantial identity. You had your identity from that moment of conception. A second version of this is called potential theory, which says, I don't think you were the same thing. I get it. I think big changes happen. But it says we should value entities in this transitive state because of their potential to be something else. So they focus on the fact it could become a person. And because this little blastocyst contains everything necessary to become a person, this potential person should be protected just as actual people are, right? Those are the biological secular arguments which are biologically based. And the strength of conception arguments is their clarity and simplicity, right? If you reject those, picking a different line is tough. And as writer Katha Pollitt observes, for religious people, DNA is a very elegant secular substitute for the concept of the soul. So the argument that abortion is morally neutral has to start with rejecting the argument that embryos are morally equivalent to you and me. And I think we'd benefit from saying it out loud, that it defies common sense to say that people are substantially the same as tiny multi-celled creatures. Yes, we share some properties, but qualities like rationality gained much later in pregnancy aren't just quantitative changes of getting bigger. They are qualitative changes of great moral significance. I have never met any pro-choice person who denies the fact of potentiality, and many of us, myself included, are quite moved by it. But that is different than being bound by it. We can still be open about our awe of the fact a tiny acorn may someday provide shade, while still acknowledging that the acorns in my yard do not have the same value as mature oak trees. And perhaps more importantly, the most pro-choice people reject the DNA argument because it's scientifically flawed. And here's why. It's not true that a fertilized egg contains everything it needs to become a person. A second condition necessary to its becoming a person is that for at least a minimum of 6 months to viability, it has to live inside a woman's body. That is not just a little tack-on condition, right? It's not scientifically accurate to say it has everything it needs. It needs that woman's body. And so to separate the analysis of embryos and fetuses from the female bodies by which they must be nourished for many months contradicts the biological reality in which a DNA approach purports to be grounded. So that's a reason that reasons for saying, one might say abortion is morally acceptable. To say it's not the same as shooting an adult. And let me tell you that the abortion rate in 2011 was 1,500 times higher than the rate of actual murder committed by women in the United States. Women in the United States committed just over 500 actual homicides, according to the FBI that year, and had 926,000 abortions. I think they saw it as different. So when someone says, like we just go to like common sense moral reasoning of people aligning their actions with their beliefs. When someone says a woman having an abortion is a murderer, I understand you saying it would be murder if you did it because you understand that to be a person. But murder is a crime that requires intent, and that's not what she intended. That's not what she saw it as. She's not. So the next step is to articulate the difference between seeing abortion as, well, some people would say a necessary evil, right? And that's the group that says, I want it to be legal for policy reasons, but I actually think it's unethical every time, right? I don't want the government to tell you what to do, but if I hear anyone's having abortion, I'm going to be at their house with a cup of coffee and an adoption pamphlet, because I really want to persuade my neighbors, but I don't want to live in a world that, forces them. That's the necessary evil. Abortion is morally acceptable, says, I don't think that's the same as a person. I think it's up to people to decide what they want to do based on their own religious, ethical views, and I think it's fine. The next step is other people say, not only is abortion morally acceptable, abortion is a moral good in the world. And just think about how radical that sounds in this political moment. The political climate that makes being called pro-abortion sounds like a slur, as if you really are picketing prenatal clinics, being like, don't do it, don't have a baby, don't have an abortion. Like that's pro-abortion, right? Nobody does that. But let's just think about what it would look like to say abortion isn't just morally acceptable, it's a moral good in the world. Why? When you believe the destruction of embryonic life is not a significant moral problem and that the freedom abortion gives women is a significant moral good, you might come to start to be in a position of abortion as a moral good. So let me give you 4 reasons that someone might hold this belief. Number 1, because they value freedom of conscience and autonomy. Abortion helps women preserve bodily integrity, decisional freedom, and the dignity of dominion over their life's course. Childbearing dramatically alters a woman's identity and life experience, and it carries a risk of death 14 times higher than abortion. When a woman does not see enduring a pregnancy and delivering a child as a benefit, an autonomy analysis respects her as a moral agent who is following her own values and allows her to decline the physical and social risks of childbearing. So moral value 1, autonomy and freedom of conscience. Moral value 2, gender justice. Women have long been subjected to legal and social discrimination based on their biological capacity for pregnancy. Today, the relatively new medical technologies, and we rarely think about abortion as a medical technology because it's been around forever, but in less safe versions and less effective versions. So our new technologies make it safe and effective, which is really a big social change. But these new technologies of contraception and abortion allow women to escape pregnancy's physical and social impact and come close to men's degree of sexual and reproductive freedom. Women cannot have social, economic, and interpersonal power comparable to men unless they can control whether and when they have children. Therefore, women's moral claim to equal opportunity requires access to abortion for pregnant women who want to use that service. All right? That's gender justice. Number 3 reason you might think of abortion as a moral good is care ethics. Abortion prevents the harms of forced childbearing and unsafe abortion. And the principle of beneficence, which we talk about in medical ethics, also illuminates some a patient's abortion decisions as an expression of mother love. In the United States, as I mentioned, 59% of abortion patients already have 1 or more children, and commitment to meeting their existing children's needs is what leads some of them to decline nature's invitation to nurture another embryo to fruition. Similarly, when a young woman can't yet be the kind of mother she wants her children to have, her abortion might be an act of mother love toward her future children, when she can be the kind of mother, do the kind of mothering that she wants to do for them. And the last reason or framing is one of economic justice. And we really rarely talk about this, and I want to leave you with this social justice framing. Abortion is a component of economic justice in the United States because parenthood is expensive. In the United States, 49% of abortion patients have incomes below the poverty line. 26% are at between 100 and 2%, what's called low income, which is still very low income. And 73% of abortion patients list can't afford a baby right now as one of their reasons. 23% listed as their most important reason. Some of them would love to have a baby or another baby, but are making a rational and sad choice that they cannot afford to do so. So, until social programs, and we could write the list of free daycare, awesome education, job opportunity, equal education, fill in your blank, remove economic barriers to child rearing, allowing low-income women and families the option of abortion prevents them from being pushed even further into poverty. So these 4 reasons that are 4 of many, I think, the freedom of conscience and value on autonomy, valuing gender justice, thinking about mother love, beneficence, and care ethics, and thinking about economic justice are reasons that people might believe abortion is actually a moral good in the world that we live in. Though they might work to create a differently configured world, as my favorite pro-life, and I use the term because that's how he describes himself, my favorite pro-life doctor says, who I've been working with for years, for many years I just assumed he wanted abortion to be illegal. And finally, I had the brains to ask him that question, because he's very passionately pro-life. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He goes, oh, no, then we'd go back to septic words. I don't want abortion to be illegal. I want it to be unnecessary. Right? And I took for granted that I knew his legal position, and I didn't. So talking to people, what kind of world do you want to live in? What role do you want abortion to play in our world? I think is important. I want to end talking about silence around the abortion experience. I began with the prevalence paradox, the idea how could something so common seem so deviant, and look at those numbers. I talk in my book a lot about abortion stigma and the issues around that, but I just want to give you this it's not a fun fact, it's a sad fact. Many women benefit from safe and legal abortion. Many of their partners who agreed with them and were on the same page, which is the vast majority, also got to finish college, also got to not be in a lifelong co-parenting relationship that was meant to be a one-night stand, also got to do a whole host of things, or stay together and marry and parent together at a time they were ready, right? And I refer to those men and all the living children later and the children who got to eat because their mom had an abortion as abortion beneficiaries. Right? People who benefited and agreed with someone else's decision. The problem is a lot of these stakeholders don't know that they are beneficiaries. They don't know that their mom could have been robbed of her fertility if she had had an unsafe abortion in college and would have never been able to have them. Right? But then they've benefited. I want to tell you about a study that said this interviewed over 4,000 women obtaining abortions at hospitals and clinics across the country. 58% of them agreed with the statement, I need to keep this abortion secret from my close friends and family. 58%. So when I talk about evidence, that we don't have evidence in a lot of the abortion debate, where does our evidence come from? It usually comes from storytelling and from each other. And the media is only going to tell us about extraordinary abortion. And the debate, the legal debate, or the political debate's only going to tell us about extraordinary abortion. It's up to us to tell each other about ordinary abortion. It's up to us to not just tell our stories and explain to each other, which I hope you will do at the coffee hour, what makes this personal to you, whether it's that roommate you drove or that sister you supported 10 years after the fact when she told you about it, whether it's just that you have a daughter and you just can't imagine living in a world where the government could force childbearing upon her against her will, whatever makes this personal for you. I hope you'll share that with each other at the coffee hour. And I want to leave you with a story for me. When you write a book, it's terrible. Don't do it. It's really hard. And I was pregnant part of the time I was writing this book, and I just felt like, oh my God, I'm having twins, because there was this book thing, and the book labor was much longer and much harder, and gestation. But then what makes it so rewarding, like parenting, is seeing it out in the world. So I want to just close with a story of two women and a piano bench. I was invited to a book club, to attend a book club that had read my book, Scarlet A. And I call it Scarlet A because my premise is that abortion, stigma has made abortion our era's Scarlet A. And women wear this invisible A and they do everything they can to hide it from each other because of this cycle that I just spoke of. And this was a group of all women who'd been together in a book club for about 15 years. And they were all neighbors. And so they'd come in at different times, but they knew each other very, very well. And my host, who was a friend of mine who had suggested the book, told me some of these later, and I'm going to tie it together for you in a way that I didn't know at the time. One woman in the book club, after the book club picked the book, told the host that she wouldn't be coming that night because she didn't want to read the book because she was deeply committed to against abortion. And she didn't need to read a book about it that could support it. She knew what she thought, and she didn't want to talk about it because of her religious beliefs. And so my friend was very surprised when she came to the book club that night and she had read the book. And through the course of the evening, the women in this book club, in the course of discussion of the book, started revealing all sorts of personal things. One person talked about an abortion she had, but she had never had children later or been married, and she'd had some very mixed feelings looking back at that. Another woman talked about her miscarriage. Another woman talked about how difficult it was to adopt her children. Women were surprising each other by saying they were just deeply pro-life. And they this generally liberal group didn't know they had a few members who felt so passionately that abortion was murder. And then another woman shared her story of having an abortion in college, and she was like, it's just no big deal. It's nothing I think about. It's not a thing. It's just what I did. You know, it was just couldn't be the kind of the most casual version, not casual, the most confident version of that. So these two women on a piano bench, the deeply Catholic woman who said she wasn't going to come was sitting next to the woman who was like, this wasn't a thing, on a piano bench. So I just can't overemphasize how close they were to one another. Physically couldn't get apart. And the beauty of this is they didn't need to. When the Catholic woman described how devastated she was that her son and his wife were going to do assisted reproduction, and that was going to create embryos that would be frozen and discarded later, and how she was so happy to have a grandchild and so devastated that it would require embryonic destruction. That's how she started. By the end of this conversation, she spoke generally, but there was just no way to not know she was speaking to the person next to her. She said, I just think it's really important for people to be telling these stories because, just sometimes you would hear someone say they had an abortion, and then you would say, I like you, I respect you. And so I just have a lot of thinking about is what a person might think. And, she's finger to shoulder with this woman who's just smiling. And though she didn't say it, I wonder if this woman had some thinking to do too about her friend's grief about these frozen embryos that were going to be discarded. And the woman who said she wasn't going to read the book told me later she was very excited to have her very pro-life husband lawyer and her two sons read it, and they were going to have family book club. And that, to what I wouldn't give to be at that dinner table, but the idea that these two women knew each other for a decade, had lots in common, lots to discuss, had never shared these ideas. And I don't think either of them changed their opinion about abortion. I don't care. I don't need that. I think they changed their opinion about each other in positive, constructive ways that put a face on an issue. And so I'm not asking anyone to go debate strangers. That's stupid. That's boring. I'm asking you to take a chance in the next month and talk to someone you actually like and you actually respect and know, but you don't know how they feel about abortion. And just find some way to bring up something on the news or share a personal experience. Let them into your thinking and your world. Open up the dialogue on this. Our rights are at stake, and there's lots of things I can email you to volunteer and to do, but it starts with us dismantling stigma and saying abortion is common. And for people in this room, believe it's an ethical act, believe it should remain an ethical act, and this is who we are. The abortion debate often seems to boil down to a question of who's more vulnerable, women or fetuses. For me, what's vulnerable is pluralism, the American principle that neighbors who disagree can live in peace side by side, which in 2019 is an idea we actually have to say out loud. Thank you very much.
I had had a question about how they come with the numbers, the statistics, in
Great.
defining abortion. Is it only women who just on their own want to terminate the pregnancy, or does it count things like missed abortions where they need a D&C, or like to define those statistics?
Yeah. Thank you. When I first heard that 1 in 3 number, I went exactly there because I've had several friends who had wanted pregnancies and fetal deaths or embryonic deaths, but it didn't pass, and so they had to empty the uterus to avoid infection. So that's this missed abortion idea. Your body didn't spontaneously abort, which we usually call a miscarriage. These numbers do not include missed abortions or medical procedures without a heartbeat. Right? So these are, because I was like, that must explain it, right? Nope. These are induced abortions. They exclude those medical miscarriages, I call them.
Thank you, Katie. I don't know how you love a book on abortion, but I really did.
That was my challenge.
And maybe you can take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about the structural versus personal stigma. You did it with the Jim Crow laws in the South.
Sure. So what Matt's referring to is in the book I talk about, so when I talk about the Scarlet A and abortion stigma, since Irving Goffman in the 60s, those of you who are sociologists in the room are excited now, the concept of stigma has focused around individual or interpersonal stigma. So the example I give in the book, I use race because it's a familiar example of the idea of a white person saying a racial epithet to a black person passing in the 1950s. We can make it today, but I go earlier to have a different image. And the idea that that's stigma. So someone in front of an abortion clinic yelling to a patient, you're a murderer, right? This interpersonal negative interaction, this personal stigma. Or you're not welcome at the dinner table because blank. You're not coming to Thanksgiving anymore because now we know you're gay and you can't bring Frank and you're not invited to Thanksgiving, right? This interpersonal stigma. More recently, sociologists have developed the concept of structural stigma, and that is laws, institutional private policies, and social norms that reinforce stigma. So take my 1950s example. We could have these two women passing each other and having an ugly verbal exchange. But when you have laws requiring segregated schools, when you have private banking policies that do redlining and don't give loans to people of color in certain neighborhoods or at all, and when you have cultural norms that say black and white people can't eat together in restaurants, this white woman doesn't need to say a word, right? She can act as if she's not at all racist because the structural stigma, the law, the private policies, and the cultural norms have sent that message 24 hours a day. They impose it when she can't be present. And she can actually believe in her heart that she is not racist because the world is structured in a way that doesn't require her to confront integration in a deeper, meaningful way. Right? And so in abortion care, I point out in the book, we are in a deep state of structural stigma where we have laws, requiring women to wait 3 days before they go from their consent to a procedure to having the procedure. Insurance that will cover everything but this. As a private policy, cultural norms that you can't talk about abortion, or your regular OBGYN who does all your other care and is trained to do this procedure can't do it for you in her office. You've got to go to a separate clinic for this care, right? So all these structurally stigmatized ways that feed into this idea that this is this deviant, dangerous act that we can't possibly speak of. And the literature I cite applies this to mental illness, but I think it's just directly applicable to abortion care. And so dismantling that structural stigma matters. So, for example, in Illinois, we have a great, in my opinion, great new law that passed last year that for our Medicaid, abortion is covered like everything else. Right? You don't need a special medical reason. They cover all prenatal care. They cover all contraceptive care. So they cover all abortion care. Why should the economics of the medical issues be driving a person's decision? Obviously, other economics might. Next year in Illinois, there'll be, I think, a fight to eliminate discrimination in our private insurance policies. Why would any non-religious insurance policy not cover abortion? because they don't want to get involved. They don't want to be political. They don't want to take heat. That's not okay. That's part of the structural stigma.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if you had any statistics on, people who've had abortions and then suddenly either go very pro-life or very pro-choice one way or another, just because, at least in my life, I know of people who they had an abortion and then, I don't know if it's through regret or something else, they've gone very pro-life. And it just seems like a very strange transition to me.
Yeah, I don't have statistics on the numbers of then where they land politically later. So the short answer is no, I don't have statistics on that. Is there more that you want to say about that? About what do you make of that when someone ends a pregnancy and then...
The individual I'm thinking of, myself personally, I think it might be regret. They from the story I was told, they waited till 5 months before they finally went through with it, even though their partner at the time was very vehemently against carrying the child to term.
So they might had a lot of ambivalence, maybe?
I don't think they wanted to do it, but I think they wanted to keep the partnership. And they tried to find a way out before it got too late. And,
sure.
Yeah.
And so now, does that individual want abortion to be illegal for everybody else?
That's the sense I get.
Yeah, if it was illegal, she wouldn't have done that. I tell a story in the book, and this is, I've heard it more than once. Every story I tell in the book, I don't mean the same story, but I heard a version of that story multiple times to make sure it wasn't just the one random thing or it represented something statistically relevant. I tell a story of a physician who is told that she has an abortion patient who seems pretty angry at the sonographer and unusually tearful and is very, having some conversation. So she goes to talk to her earlier in the steps than she would and said, what's the problem, basically? And the woman said, abortion is murder, and I don't think I should be here. She was like, well, that's a lot to talk about. She said, no, but I have to be, and all these things. Then the physician disclosed that she recognized her. She was a picketer from a different location. And so the physician said, I got to be honest that I recognize you from our other location and you're picketing, so it sounds like this is something that goes against maybe something you believe, and had a long conversation with her about, we don't have to do this today, let's talk about it. And the patient was adamant. Oh, and it was her second abortion she saw from her chart, but she thought she must have had a change of heart. And she said, no, can't in my job where I am now with this partner, all the ordinary reasons. Said, go home, think about it, this kind of, no, got to do this, I'm positive. Saw the counselor, and finally the physician said, it decided it would be discriminatory to hold her to a higher standard after she been so firm in her decision and her reasons. But she did say, abortion is murder, and if this was illegal, I wouldn't be here, but I'm weak, so I am. And as a clinical ethicist, that's a case about, is that informed consent? Or is it a different kind of stigma where we require people to parrot back the language we're comfortable with in order to make their own medical decisions? I just find this area so fascinating and rich, and has nothing to do with being for or against anything. I am for autonomy. What does it mean for that woman to express her autonomy, right? And ultimately, she did choose to have that abortion, and then weeks later, the physician saw her back on the picket line. And so... The analogy I use in the book is I don't talk about opinion polling in the book. I kind of could care less what you say on the phone you think you believe. I'm super interested in behavior, which we never talk about. And my basketball career began and ended in 7th grade, but the one thing I took away was don't look at someone's face when they have the ball, the eyes. The head can fool you. Watch the chest. Follow the body. Body don't lie. And so in my book, I follow the body. I don't follow the words. Your friend interests me a lot, and she doesn't surprise me or seem aberrational in some ways. Let's talk.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Watson. I'd just like to say that since we are all ethical humans, the single most important ethical thing we can all do this afternoon is to go home and send a contribution, point and click, National Organization for Women, now.org, NAREL, Pro-Choice America, Center for Reproductive Rights, National Abortion Federation, Guttmacher Institute, Midwest Access Coalition, and ACLU of Illinois. And don't forget the Chicago Abortion Fund.
The question was, would you like to donate to these causes? Great, thanks.
I've heard something on the news about a controversy in the state of Virginia right
Yeah.
now, and I wonder if you could explain what's going on, please.
I would love to. Thank you for asking that. So, Roe versus Wade said that states may ban abortion after viability, which now happens around 24 weeks at the end of the second trimester. They don't have to, and a couple states don't. But if they do ban it, it is constitutionally required to have an exception for women's lives and their health. That is required by Roe versus Wade. Now, some states pass statutes that contradict Roe. Federal constitutional law always trumps whatever the state house does, okay? But it just stays on the books. And it creates a chilling effect for physicians who say, well, I know you have developed, this pregnancy has increased your blood flow, and it's revealed you have a life-threatening cardiac condition. And the more blood pumping, the more, this is going to cause your heart to explode, or, you have just this life-threatening diabetes right now, or whatever the condition is. Or we've discovered in later testing that your fetus has a medical issue that's incompatible with life, or this kind of thing, right, that kind of develop later in pregnancy. A physician in a state like Virginia that doesn't have that have written a law that doesn't include that health exception, though he or she may know she has a constitutional right to this, no one's stepping up to be the test case, right? So she's going to have to leave the state to have that procedure. So we have women traveling all over the United States to get procedures to which they are constitutionally entitled, right? You're not constitutionally entitled to your knee replacement. You're not constitutionally entitled to your dialysis. You're not constitutionally entitled to any other health care except child delivery and abortion. Yet this is the one we have to travel for and that your insurance won't cover? So what Virginia tried to do was just simply to codify, and this is what states across the country are doing, to codify Roe, right? So if Roe goes down in state X, we'll still have that as our state law, right? It'll be in place. Illinois did that last year. And we had trigger language that said if Roe goes down, abortion becomes a crime in Illinois. And it got flipped to say if Roe goes down, the law of Roe and Doe versus Beal, the decision decided the same day that did the life and health stuff, will be the law of Illinois. So Roe goes down, we wake up tomorrow in Illinois, exactly the same, right? So Virginia was this legislator I think was trying to modify to codify that. Abortion opponents have seized on that as if that was like a brand new idea. That women's health that a woman doesn't have to die to have a baby, right? But health matters too. So to say, well, it wasn't going to kill you, but you were going to lose your kidney function and be on dialysis for the rest of your life, which would shorten your lifespan significantly, have that baby. The state can force you, right? The legislator, I believe her name is Kathy Tran. I think she handled a moment very poorly. There's a great op-ed in the New York Times that describes this. She was asked, so does that mean that while a woman is about to be in labor, or is in labor, she could tell her physician, I want an abortion? And she just wasn't prepared, and that's a problem in this area. You got to be prepared to talk. And she said, well, that would be up to the doctor and the woman. No, it wouldn't be. If she's got no health problem, right? And also, what physician in the world? Right? There's like a dozen physicians just right now that will do later term abortions. So you're assuming that there are women who 2 days before delivery would be like, I'm just kidding. And then there are physicians who'd be like, great, come to me. They don't exist. Right? But this legislator, I think, made a terrible misstep that has gone viral. The governor didn't help. And so there's and then New York just passed its law basically codifying Roe. So New York is set, taking it out of the criminal code, putting it in public health. There's a dramatic and very well-funded misinformation campaign going on right now about both New York and Virginia, gearing up to try to make third trimester abortion a huge 2020 campaign issue. The last statistic I'll leave you with is 20 weeks and over. So 20 to 24, totally legal, 24 and over, life and health. Only 1.4% of all abortions happen at 20 weeks or later. If we didn't have the restrictions we had and we had better funding, women weren't waiting to raise the money, I think the gestational ages would go down significantly. You're against later abortion? Fund abortion.
Hello. Very interesting. Thank you. Do you have any sense of like a particular step that could be taken to drastically reduce the statistics that would occur? Like, for example, like the flu shot, you can just go into a Walgreens and get a flu shot. What if you could just go into a Walgreens and get free birth control? Like, what would that impact look like? And also, can I be your new best friend?
Yes. That's the nicest question anyone's ever asked me after a lecture. Thank you. You had me at best friend. Let me go back, though, to the less interesting question about contraception. So I don't have any numbers, or excuse me, I keep my wild Italian gesticulation is not good for this. I don't have any numbers about how, whatever. But obviously contraceptive access is huge. And that's why it's so great that the ACA covered no-cost sharing contraception. That was the whole point. Like, if that $20 copay is keeping you from contraception. It's also the case that what I call drugstore methods versus the most effective methods. The most effective methods require a doctor's appointment, and they're more expensive. The pill and the IUD versus condoms and foams and jellies and stuff you can get at the drugstore, right? IUD could be up to $1,000 plus a visit. People just don't have the upfront ability to do that. Most people don't. And when I shared with you those statistics of the 49% of people living under the poverty line, sure don't have $1,000 to go to an IUD. So contraceptive access is huge. There was I can't say the number off the top of my head, but a dramatic dip in teen pregnancy in the intervals that were measured. There's new Guttmacher data coming out, so I'm going to have to memorize a whole new set of numbers, but they don't know how to quite figure it out, but it appears to be the availability of emergency contraception in drugstores. 16-year-old girls know when they've had unprotected sex. And if they know how to get to Walgreens and take EC, which does not cause an abortion but prevents fertilization, they can prevent those pregnancies on their own. So you mentioned like access. So contraceptive access is huge. It's also very important to say it won't, and there's a huge disparity in unintended pregnancy. So in women under the poverty line, 60% of all pregnancies are unintended. 60%. Over 200% of the poverty line, 30%. That's my income group, and we're not batting 1,000 there, guys. So 30% unintended, 60% unintended. So getting any parity of control of your life. However, contraceptive will not solve the entire problem. That's like saying seatbelts, we won't have any more injuries after car crashes, right? I bet many people in this room who are very smart and have access to contraception have not used it at one evening in their life, whether drinking or the rush of passion or whatever your reasons were, didn't use contraception, right? And power and sexual dynamics affect people's use of contraception. I don't want to look like I intended to have sex tonight, so I'm not going to have a condom in my purse. There's lots of complicated things, and contraception fails too. So this is not what you were suggesting, but people who are like, let's just work together to eliminate abortion. We're never going to eliminate abortion. Never going to happen. Always going to need it. Could we reduce the rates? It's an interesting question. People get prickly about that because they're like, are you saying abortion is a bad thing? This whole safe, legal, and rare thing that's been attacked. For me, I think abortion's hard on our country. It challenges pluralism. It causes friction. So if there's a way to get rates down, no one loves having an abortion. No one's like, this is the greatest day ever. Most people would prefer to prevent that pregnancy if they could. So I'm completely supportive of any efforts to get that number down because it's not good for patients. Right? That it's not, why do it if you don't have to? Other women would say, why should I be putting hormones in my body and going through all this medical stuff to not get pregnant? I'll have an abortion or two, and that'll be better for me medically. It's really fascinating for me to talk to those women and be like, ooh, what would be my problem with that? I have to think about that. Thanks. Yeah, hi.
Hi, I'm so glad I came today.
Oh, good.
So can you touch a little bit on the Hyde Amendment, the justification for it, the future? It's so nonsensical, paradoxical to me.
Yeah, crazy.
How it even exists. And by the way, wouldn't it reduce the late-term abortions or the later abortions by having funding for it?
Totally. Totally. So the Hyde Amendment that you're referring to is a rider that comes on every year, is voted on, that says federal funds, now it's even more expensive than it started, but federal funds not going to be spent on abortion. And there's a federal Medicaid program, without getting too wonky about this, and then state Medicaid programs, and they work in partnership. So it says none of the federal Medicaid monies are going to be spent on abortion. States can do whatever they want. So that's what Illinois is doing right now, just to use that as an example, using all the state Medicaid money to cover abortion care, still receiving federal reimbursement for all the other stuff. So the Hyde Amendment, it was 1977 when it was the first iterations and challenges to it, and there's a set of horrible Supreme Court decisions in 77 that basically say, okay, well, this constitutional right, it's basically a negative liberty, right? The right to be left alone. It's not a positive right to be assisted. And the state, this is the language of the Supreme Court, the state is not responsible for removing obstacles that are not of its own creation. So if you were poor before you got pregnant, you're poor after you got pregnant, the government didn't put that obstacle of poverty in front of you. If it wants to help you with some of that poverty with programs that target A, B, and C, it can do that. It doesn't have to. This constitutional right doesn't come with a right of access. To me, that's when Roe got gutted, right? Because it said this is the only, freedom of speech. You can be heard by more people if you own a newspaper press, right? Like other rights can be better exercised with money. So I don't mean to say it's completely unique, but this one's pretty dependent on money to be exercised. So to have an abortion right without a negative right, without an affirmative right to access is nonsensical, right? It's a very unique right. This gets us, the last sentence I'll say is the difference between reproductive freedom and reproductive justice. So raise your hand if you've heard the concept of reproductive justice, right? Oh, cool. When I was coming up, it was all reproductive freedom, the right to be left alone, right? I think this is facile, but it's upon reflection, you're like, okay, that's a rich white lady right. Because no one ever challenged my right to have children. And if I have the economic means to have children, I didn't worry about that side of the ledger, right? Reproductive justice says you have to have whatever support you need to have a child or not have a child and live in health and security, right? And to have the kind of family you want. So that might mean Medicaid assistance or government assistance to have an abortion. That means safe neighborhoods. That means schools that make sense. That means policies that allow you to be a parent and not have families destroyed by foster care unfairly for the crime of being poor, right? To the destruction of the right to parent. And so the Medicaid cases are what first cut the knees out of that. 16 states have changed that policy on their state policy level. And so I have been active in that work and very supportive of that movement because I think it's just an issue of human dignity.
You've answered all my questions, but I just had a comment. No, you don't get it yet. Yes, there is a question in here. Except that I do escort, we both actually do escorts, and although not so much recently, but still, it seems that most of the impetus behind the anti-people outside of clinics is religious. And so the religious basis of abortion, of resistance to any kind of abortion rights or abortion period, which is reinforced by the Catholic Church setting up Operation Rescue that was fronted by Protestants and the whole thing with Catholic bishops and all that jazz. What kind of difficulties do you see in resolving this religious opposition in a way that neutralizes their opposition, their sometimes violent and fatal opposition to abortion rights?
I want to neutralize their violence. I don't need to neutralize their opposition because I do think they're perfectly entitled to have their point of view and they're perfectly entitled to try to share it in civil and appropriate ways. I do think screaming with a bullhorn in people's faces as they're walking into a medical appointment is not a civil and appropriate way to express that opposition. But I'm a civil liberties girl, and I'm going to defend their right to express their view and hold their view. However, I think what we need to do, the Establishment Clause claims have routinely failed to say this was just the imposition of religious policy in the United States. Just because thou shalt not kill is one of the 10 commandments doesn't mean homicide statutes are a violation of church and state, right? You can have secular reasons for things that are also religiously prohibited. So the argument that abortion bans are in law a violation of the Establishment Clause or just imposing religious perspectives legally has failed. I gave you the secular case, but I do think a lot of this is religiously motivated. I think on the religious front, we need to reclaim the freedom of conscience and this idea of freedom of affirmative conscience, that the freedom that abortion decisions involve conscience, whether they're motivated by religious or other types of conscience, and try to put that on the spectrum with the religious views, right? Religion is a club. They get to have their own rules. You can join or leave the club. The rules only apply to club members. And to try to keep that clarity matters to me. So that freedom of conscience framing is potentially useful.
All right, thank you. We are
Terrific.
out of time.